It's safe to say that GPUs from both AMD and NVIDIA are kind of coming towards the end of their life. New cards are on the horizon, and the last few releases from NVIDIA have been what could essentially be classed as tweaked variants of already existing cards. We've seen the 3090 Ti, we've had the 3080 12GB, which improved upon the 10GB model, somewhat making it kind of redundant, and then we saw the 3080 Ti, which then kind of saw its, well, you know, make it self-redundant because the pricing was just too damn similar. What I'm trying to say is that high-enders had a lot of choices, and some would argue a bit too much. But what about the low end? What about the stuff that actually matters, that people actually go out and buy? Well, that, my friends, is where the GTX 1630 comes in. What's that all about? Maybe it's a solid upgrade for those rocking older cards from either AMD or NVIDIA. Well, that's what we're going to find out today, after this quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32GB of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. So first and foremost, before you go and check your calendars in case you think you've stumbled into some kind of time warp, yes, NVIDIA have released a GTX 16 series card, and they did so kinda quietly, and it's called the GTX 1630. And I have to ask one big question. Why? Yes, 1080p gaming is still the most popular resolution when we look at the Steam hardware survey being dominated by a huge 66% of the market. And with the GTX 1060, 1650 and 1050 Ti taking the top 3 spots as the most popular GPUs, maybe NVIDIA thought the 1630 would be a wise choice. Give the people what they want, or at least what NVIDIA think they want. What could go wrong there, eh? Now there are some issues straight off the bat. While I'm all for new models adopting the latest technology, this isn't the latest technology. And being a 16 series card means we get Turing instead of Ampere. Do you remember Turing? Yeah, I know. Right, considering Ampere launched with the RTX 3080 back in September of 2020, it does kind of feel like NVIDIA are trying to flog a dead horse. And for anyone outside of the UK, that's an actual expression that we say for some weird reason. I don't know why. So architecture aside, what does the 1630 bring to the table? Well, 4GB of GDDR6 for a start, so it's not groundbreaking, but it's served the GTX 1650 and 1650 Super fine since their inception. But that's about as far as it goes, because other than that, it's all very lackluster. You get 512 CUDA cores, which, for those not technically minded, is 384 less than the GTX 1650. And the performance on that card isn't exactly wow. So that should give you some kind of indication as to what's to be expected. But it gets worse. While it shares the same amount of GDDR6 memory, NVIDIA have opted for a stonking 64-bit memory interface, compared to the 120-bit that was seen on the GTX 1650 and the 192-bit interface that we've seen on the GTX 1060. I mean, yeah, we get DX12 support and some of the other cool tech from NVIDIA like Ansel, Shadowplay, Reflex, and the Volta NVENC encoder for those who want to stream. But that's where the good stuff ends, because on paper, I'm just not expecting much at all, especially when you see the price. I mean, just from a quick look around, and bearing in mind that prices are on their way down, the cheapest we could find a GTX 1630 in the UK was £179. And on top of that, we couldn't even find one in the US, but indications seem to point to a price of around $150 to $160. Then taking a look at the price of a GTX 1650, and you can pick one up for $184.99 in the UK or $197 in the US. So all I'm saying is keep this in mind as we go through our benchmarks. And as always, due to the amount of titles that we test, we'll be showing as much as we can here, but we'll also be posting lots more over on our Patreon, where you also get a ton of other benefits, including behind the scenes content, access to our super special area on Discord, and much more. The link is down below. In terms of the testing components, we ran the game on our X570 based test bench with our Ryzen 9 5900X on an Asus Crosshair 8 Dark Hero motherboard. We used 32GB of Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB 3600MHz dual channel memory, and due to the type of cards and not all of them supporting it, we disabled resizable bar and smart access memory to make things as fair as possible. Also, due to the nature of the cards we tested, we ran all 18 of our tests at 1080p on the medium preset or medium settings when presets weren't available. There was one exception to this rule that I will explain when we get to it. So, starting off with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and what a start it is! The starting pistol had only really just been fired and the GTX 1630 has already fallen flat on its face, only managing to get 31 frames a second on average, and not even getting above 30 in the 1% lows. Something extra damning about this is that when we look at the GTX 1060 3GB from multiple generations ago, we see a pretty decent jump in performance for an older card that has less VRAM than the 1630, and likely coming in at lower costs if you don't mind the second-hand market. Moving on to Warzone, the average FPS has gone up a little, but still not particularly amazing, it must be said. And now we also see the 1650, which has leveled out in performance with the 1063GB, both getting 47 FPS averages, with the 1066GB managing to get above the 60 FPS threshold. Now let's move on to an easier to run game, CSGO. Here we see almost every card getting above 300 FPS, with more than half getting right to the edge of 400 FPS. Now there was a single card that didn't manage to get above 300 FPS, in fact it didn't even manage to get half of the FPS of the very next best performer, and of course that card is the 1630. And I get that even though most people wouldn't complain about 175 frames per second, this is definitely a matter of perspective. Next up is Cyberpunk, and in this test the 1050 Ti ended up being the worst performer, but only barely though. It managed to get the same average as the 1630, but saw 1 frame less in the 1% lows. Considering how most of our cards struggled here, the performance of the 1630 isn't all too bad in comparison to the other cards, but even so, it still wouldn't make for a good gaming experience. Surprisingly, Cyberpunk wasn't the hardest to run game we tested. That game was Dying Light 2. At 1080p, the 1630 didn't even manage an average of 20 FPS, with only one card managing to get above 60 in this test, the 5600 XT. But almost all of the cards that did get lower than 60 still felt playable, though as soon as we dropped below 30 FPS, it started to feel sluggish and hard to play. When we were getting 18 FPS on the 1630, we just found it kind of just wasn't even worth putting up with, and to find something that's acceptable, you'd have to drop settings pretty dramatically. Moving on from the hard to play to the nice to play, Far Cry 6 never felt like it was unplayable at any point during testing. The 1630 still ended up with the lowest performance here, but it wasn't bad enough to be considered unplayable. Another game that performed well enough to play without any issues was Gears 5, where we saw the same kind of thing we've seen throughout our testing. The 1630 is once again at the bottom of our chart with the worst performance, but it wasn't exactly unplayable performance, but I still just expected a little bit more. So moving on to a game that was the exception for our medium settings rule, GTA 5. The reason we changed settings here was due to most of the cards hitting the hard 188 FPS cap. So to compensate, we retested on the highest settings at 1080p, and once again, the 1630 was the worst performer, being the only card that didn't manage to get above 60 FPS. Meanwhile, half of our cards managed to get above 100 FPS, with the 5600 XT being at the upper limit of just under 150 FPS. Next up is Halo Infinite, which came with some slightly unexpected results. For some reason, the RX 6500 XT was actually the worst performing card here, getting only 33 frames per second on average. We did retest this card, but it still garnered the same results. That did, however, put the 1630 in a slightly better light at 37 FPS average, but it still wasn't that playable per se, but I guess you could say it'll do. What we did find was that Halo felt hard to play at frame rates below 60 FPS, which means that only 4 of the cards we tested actually felt playable. And I'm actually counting the 1060 3GB here, as it was only 1 frame away from 60, and the difference wasn't noticeable at all. Moving on to Horizon Zero Dawn, the 1630 was again at the bottom of the scoreboard, earning itself 10 frames less than the next best performer, the 1050 Ti. But both of these cards didn't feel that good to play on anyway. We were able to get playable frame rates when we moved up to the GTX 1650, with everything above this point being perfectly playable. Our second to last game is Resident Evil Village, set to the balanced preset. We noticed that it did exactly what is advertised. It was a good balance of visuals and performance that earned every card a playable frame rate. Here, the 1630 managed to beat both the 1063GB and the 1050 Ti by a single frame per second on average, but the 1650 and above saw some sizable disparity to it, with a huge favour going towards AMD based cards. And our final game is Rainbow Six Siege. This game was very easy to run, and even the 1630 managed to get 90 FPS, which would feel impressive if it wasn't for a little thing called relativity. And relative to the other cards we tested, the 1630 was again our worst performer. Literally every other card managed to get at least 100 FPS, with the majority managing over 144, which, as we know, is a very common frame rate for gaming monitors. So with all the games tested, let's round off the performance numbers with a look at the average performance across all the 18 games that we tested. And, to no one's surprise, the GTX 1630 is the worst performer overall, not even pulling off an overall average of 60 FPS, whilst all the other cards managed to pull scores that were above 60. And the slightly beefier 1650 managed to get 86 FPS on average overall. And remember, if you want to see the rest of our benchmarks, you can over on our Patreon, link is down below. Now before I tear into the 1630 as a whole, I do want to mention Palit, because that's the card we have here and the one that we tested. I don't blame Palit for this, because I get it. They're an NVIDIA partner and they produce cards based on the GPU cores that they buy from NVIDIA. And that resulted in the dual card that I had here today, which, being low end, I'll admit, it's hard to get excited about. It's small, it has 2 fans and a big chunk of a heatsink that covers the majority of the card. But I did find it odd that it has a 6-pin power connector. But with a 75 watt TDP, using just the PCI Express slots provided power would see it, I guess, right at the cusp of what's being able to be delivered to it. Though saying that, the Palit 1650 that we tested doesn't actually require any extra power. And talking of power, I guess you could say the Palit did okay in this area at 190.7 watts at load. Where it did exceed was Acoustics at 36.6 decibels at load, which compared to cards like the RX 6400, you could argue was borderline silent in comparison. Now, when it came to temperatures, there was nothing to worry about at a modest 63 degrees load, but with cards like the 1050 Ti not only performing better in most of our games, but also doing better in the thermal department, it's not exactly redeemed itself much, if at all. So let's talk about the 1630 as a GPU core. Okay, so performance is pretty disappointing, to put it lightly, but maybe the 1630 can make up for this low performance in value. It may yet still prove itself as a valuable budget card. And no, the 1630 is actually the worst value for money here, at £3.58 per frame. The silver lining, if you could call it that, is that the best value cards were all ones that we couldn't actually find new. So we looked at the second-hand market to see how much they were going for now. And they have actually proven themselves to be the best value for money, at least in the UK. So what about in the US? Well, I don't know how, but somehow it got worse. Pretty much $4 per frame, which isn't good value at all. And the final nail in the coffin, the 1630 isn't even the cheapest card here. Going for around £180 or $160 or so, you can easily find better value for money pretty much anywhere, whether it be new or even used. Remember, value for money doesn't necessarily mean cheaper, but offers a better prospect based on the performance you're getting for the money that you're paying. So the GTX 1630, what do I think of it? Well, quite frankly, and you all know me, I don't beat around the bush, so I won't, but it's crap. And in my opinion, is a complete waste of money. My best advice is to just skip a few coffees and use that money to buy something better, like a potato, Honestly, that's better value for money than this, and also more versatile too. You can make all sorts with potatoes, and all you can do with a 1630 is seemingly weigh some paper down with it, which a potato can also do just as well. See? Value for money. So there you have it. I mean, come on, do you agree with me? Is this just a waste of silicon? What were NVIDIA even thinking? A quick cash grab on the low end while stock was a mess? With that seemingly kind of, I guess, all behind us now, I feel the 1630 will go down in history as the card that never was and that no one ever wanted. And I don't honestly think it will be missed, do you? Let me know in the comment section below. And again, if you appreciate the huge work that we put into these tests and these videos, consider signing up to our Patreon, where you can laugh at even more of the testing data from this frankly pointless card. With that, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be absolutely amazing, unlike this graphics card. And I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.